Okay, so this video is going to be entitled, Is Incest the Only Way Mr. Rood's Solution, using the Shem Tob Matthew, which is, there are two 13th century manuscripts, or excuse me, manuscripts from the 1300s, when Shem Tob is circulating these copies of the Hebrew Matthew for preparation in the disputations of Jewish scholars with Christian scholars. Are these two manuscripts that say Joseph was the father of Mary? Can these prove Jesus is of the house of David, which we're going to see requires a patrilineal lineage without this being incest, and on its face, without making any thing but that one change that shows up in the Shem Tob manuscripts? It doesn't tell you you can avoid that she's marrying the person that's described as Joseph. Okay, so just so we are clear here, so let's though ask ourselves, if we assume that it's Mary is the son of a person named Joseph, and there is another Joseph who is the father of Jesus technically, who is not being his line. We have no idea if he's of Davidic line from the book of Matthew. We're not told that. We may learn that from Luke, by the way. But assuming Luke didn't exist, this book on its own, could this sustain the book of Matthew? Could it sustain that Jesus had a Davidic lineage from the proof it's providing? And so and would the author of the book of Matthew have written this to have no proof at all of a Davidic lineage that was patrilineal? So this is how you have to weigh, is this textual variant legitimate? In other words, so could this possibly mean what? Well, I'll show you what is the argument, and then the only solution is if you're willing to go with incest. So, which is no solution at all. So there's no these manuscript variants are not legitimate. There's no way we can take them to be legitimate, and we'll show you why. So I just want to show you the question, and this was put in a very fair, reasonable manner. So I like people who do this, and it makes you think. He goes, Jay writes, and this is November 2022. You do know that Joseph or Yosef in Hebrew is a common name, right? Okay. It's not uncommon to have both sides in the family that has that name. Mary's father is also named Joseph. Now he's assuming that from these two manuscripts. It does not mean they are the same person. Okay, we're going to assume that for the moment. And now you're going to see that there's going to be anomalies that don't work that way as well. But anyway, he's being reasonable. So no incest there. So there's no incest if this person who's her father is not Joseph, her husband. And that's what he wants you to suppose. But now we have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable to construe what we're looking at is somebody who doesn't think this person is Joseph that she's marrying? And it clearly does, even in the Shem Tob. And just because only two manuscripts of Shem Tob Matthew out of apparently 28 manuscripts at this time, and only from the 12th to 13th century timeline that has Joseph as Miriam's father in Matthew 1:16, it does not mean that it's the one that is false. It does not mean that it's the one that is false. So in other words, these variants shouldn't be determined to be false. They should be determined to be true, he's saying. Perhaps those two manuscripts are the copies of the original Matthew Gospel. Okay, so 13 centuries later, he's saying it's legitimately possible, and that's it is possible if it's being copied, faithfully for 1,300 years. And the problem is, it's two variants at a time when the people who are having to come up with these arguments out of the Hebrew Matthew are Jewish scholars who are not allowed to say anything that's heretical. So if they said, we believe you didn't have a virgin birth, a virgin birth doesn't solve anything, they're going to be in big trouble, because that's because you're denying Jesus a Davidic lineage if you told them all the truth. So they may have a motivation to make it look like they know a solution to your problem. Jesus had a Davidic lineage because the mother had the child, and then they might be pulling the wool over the eyes of the Gentiles who don't know that's not possible, and we're going to get into that. So, on its face, if he's correct, he's right. If Joseph is a not that Joseph that gave her birth is in the Davidic line, but is not her husband, as it shows on the text. This is what the text is saying: is this person the same person as her husband? If that appearance that's intentional by the writer of this piece in all manuscripts, that Joseph, the Joseph that is said right in that sentence before, is also her husband later, this is possible. Then there's not incest if there's another Joseph that we don't know about, and there's a mistake. In other words, the scribes just don't record there's another Joseph, or that Joseph, her husband, is not the same Joseph as the Joseph that gave her birth. Okay, so I think I've made that as clear or unclear as possible, but I think that's the answer. And so he would be right. There wouldn't be incest if the Joseph that gave her birth is not the same as her husband, even though the text looks that way. Okay, and before I want to look at the Hebrew Matthew itself from Professor Howard, and then show you how the word goes in there. But I want you to see why Mr. Rood felt it was so convincing to him, is because if you make that one change and can imagine there's a second Joseph that we're not her husband, it is not actually being identified here at all, getting rid of the risk of incest is a solution, is you then would have the solution that without Mary being in the generations prior, in among all the generations, you only had 12 generations until Jacob begets Joseph. So Joseph can only beget a 13th generation. But if Mary's in the middle, you see the benefit here now. Mary becomes the generation 13. So if it said Jacob begat Joseph, the father of Mary. So the word father is what is in these two variants that Nehemiah Gordon found. So Jacob begat Joseph. Now we get a 13th. The father of Mary means Mary is a 13th generation of whom was born Jesus. That comes out to 14 generations, and that matches verse 1, Matthew 1, verse 17. So I wanted to make sure we understand why Mr. Rood was so excited by this possibility. It would solve the other problem that the truth is, if you just fix the virgin birth and gave Jesus a Davidic lineage by having a true heir who was of Davidic line, then you still have the problem, unless this verse variant exists, that there's only 13 generations. Just you can't say any longer there's a 13th for Mary. The 13th would be Jesus, and therefore the verse violates Matthew verse 1, chapter 1, verse 17. So all virgin birth accounts, even if you solved it and you said, so in other words, absent this kind of correction, all the virgin birth accounts are corrupted anyway. Somebody other than Matthew wrote this section because the math doesn't work on its face. But now if you believe this, Jacob begat Joseph and the father of Mary, then therefore Joseph begat Mary. Therefore you have 13, and then Jesus becomes 14. So that would solve that problem, but you've created new problems because now we have a matrilineal line. So now we have to say, how plausible is this a true solution for Christianity? And the answer is no. Okay, so why is okay, so the reason this doesn't work is there's no such thing as a matrilineal line. Okay, now oral law says to prove that you are Jewish, you can say my mother was Jewish, and if she's Jewish, you're Jewish. Okay, but that's oral law. It's not in the law given Moses. Moses was given one law, one way to count lines. And there's many examples, but I'm just going to use the one that comes to mind fastest. And that's Numbers 1, verses 1 to 2. In the King James, it says, the Lord, Yahweh, spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of the congregation on the first day of the second month in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, quote, and so this is going to take a census and a count. says, "Take you the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male by their polls." So this is the way you count families. This is how you do genealogy. This is who comes from whom is done by the house of their fathers. So uh, that seems to be that Jesus has to have a human father. If he does not have a human seed of David in his mother, in other words, unless Mary is impregnated by a male of the Davidic line, she still does not have the necessary lineage to pass on to Jesus. So just simply that she's born in the Davidic line and he's born of her does not give him a mother who had sexual intercourse, I'm going to be blunt here, with somebody who was of the Davidic line. And that seems to be what they mean to have a father who had been a son of David. The way this reads, it's his grandfather would be like her mother. Mary's father is the grandfather to Jesus. So this is a grandfather to grandson, and that's not how it works. That has to be of your father's house, not of your grandfather's house. And the Bible makes a clear distinction between a father and a grandfather. It itself uses different terms for these positions. So this is measured by your father's house. So anything that cuts off Joseph as the actual literal genealogical father of Jesus, the Joseph, not this Joseph we're hypothesizing is not even her husband, just some other Joseph, as that's what Jay is asking me to assume. So my point is that then you run to this roadblock. And so you have solved the number crisis, the Matthew verse 117, but you still have not solved the fundamental problem of a virgin birth, which deprives Jesus of any lineage by the law standards of how you measure that, which is by your father's house, not by your grandfather's house, but by your father's house. And you are then of the house of David if your father is of the house of David, not if your grandfather's of the house of David. And it may sound strict, but these are how these rules are written. I didn't make up the word father. I didn't make the distinction between that word father and the word grandfather. This is how God defined it. And if it was supposed to be more lax than this, God should have told us, because this has become now a critical issue. He did not ever tell us we could measure by grandfathers. Therefore, we are measuring it by the father's house. And Jesus does not have a human father. Therefore, he, according to the virgin birth account, and that's the whole point, is the virgin birth account legitimate? And I'm just going to say here is right now, we have to, and I also think that God makes it that we have to have a persuasive case that we can prove this account is legitimate. And I'm going to tell you the actual account, which is that Joseph begot Jesus, has much more legitimacy going back into the record books than does this version on two errant manuscripts. So so anyway, that's my point, is this runs into a roadblock here. And then the only alternative is to accept the way it reads now. So I want you to see how it reads, and it's not going to read pretty if you don't make these assumptions about there being two Josephs involved here, and one's not written down. And even though this appears to be, this says on its face it's Joseph, her husband, is also her father. We just have to look at the text the way it reads in the Shem Tob. And so the way we're going to do that is take the Hebrew Matthew of Howard, which is the Shem Tob in English, and then put in the word father instead of husband, and we'll see how it reads. All right, so now we're looking at the Hebrew Matthew of Professor Howard, and this is verse 16, And what we're told by Nehemiah Gordon, we haven't seen any scholarly proof of this yet, but I believe he's an honest man, so I'm going to take his word for it. It says this Joseph was the father of Mary in 2 manuscripts out of 25, 28. I think it's 28 total manuscripts he said he eventually found. And one of the 2 is just simply a square box of verses 1 to 16 of chapter 1, which is very much what I would say is a cheat sheet that these scholars would use if they were asked, how do you account for Jesus being a Davidic heir? He would say, oh, well, here's my answer. And, Christians being Gentiles, we would have no idea that numbers 1 verses 1 to 2 exists, and you'd count by the patrilineal line, not a matrilineal line. But be that as it may, we're just going to we'll assume for a minute you have a matrilineal line as a possibility and look at the chances this was written correctly to say that Joseph was the father of Mary. Okay. So first of all, if you want to show that she's of a generation, you have to use, it's clear every time you want to show how many generations there are, you use the word begot. And I'm just showing a couple of verses here, but I could go backwards. So it's anomalous that this is changing. This Joseph was the father of Mary. That's what we're supposed to believe, that she's it could have just simply said, and Joseph begot Mary. Why doesn't it just say that? So it's doing exactly what you would expect if the author wants to say something other than a begetting relationship between the two of them. You would use another noun. You'd say it's the husband, or this is being taken, though, as saying the word father, but you would have said begotten. You would have said Joseph begot Mary. That's all. So it doesn't make sense why the word begot is not being continued in the pattern, particularly when you have to count the number of generations given in the very next verse. You have 14, and now you get 14. So it's just anomalous. And now the other anomaly is now you have a Joseph who comes out of nowhere. So it just so happens it's a same name Joseph or Yosef as her father. I mean, it makes much more sense that it was husband originally. Okay, so let's look at verse 18. The birth of Jesus was in this way. It came to pass when his mother was betrothed to Joseph. Well, this Joseph isn't being introduced. In other words, if there's another Joseph who's her father, and now she's marrying someone named Joseph, if we don't want to lead to the conclusion that it's incest, that she's marrying her own father, this author should be somewhat alert to this horrible crime against all cultures. Even the pagan cultures didn't allow a father to marry his own daughter, let alone have any sexual relations with his own child. So this is the anomaly you get up is somebody would have to say to themselves, oh, I better mention here that Joseph is not her father. Her give this guy another name, Joseph Ben, pick another name of who he is the child of. So it doesn't do that. And so we have this problem is now you have the author of this book, this portion of Matthew should have, if it wasn't, if it indeed said Mary is the child, or actually Joseph is the father of Mary, something would have crossed the person's mind and said, hey, I better introduce this person who happens to have the same name, Joseph, and identify him as differently. So somehow say, give a different lineage of his, just Joseph, the son of the baker or whatever, candlestick maker. But he doesn't do that here. Now, in theory, if you go over to Luke, you can maybe fix things, but you have to understand Luke hasn't been written for quite a while. In fact, this is written around 37 AD. Luke isn't going to be written until about around 60 AD. So 23 years, nobody's going to have, people have to read this for 23 years. It's not going to make any sense. So you have to think about the immediate audience that's going to receive this. If you don't put down the words, Joseph by some other name, son of something else, you would naturally conclude that the Joseph that's identified in 16 is also who she's betrothed to. Therefore, she's betrothed to her own father if you accept these manuscript errors. So I would say that you have a real textual problem of incest being the likely solution or suggestion, that the whoever authored this was almost trying to mock us, sabotage us. So I again, if it said if it said Joseph was the father of Mary, it would only be more evidence of the person who wrote this is sabotaging Christianity. First of all, this person put in Jaconia in the line. That screwed us over, right? If he meant that Mary's father was Joseph, and then clearly just shows Joseph is marrying her, making it look like a product of incest. And now it's even grosser. So this would be more proof of somebody who's sabotaging Christianity. And of course, putting in the virgin birth itself was sabotaging of Christianity, because now you wouldn't even have this problem. As long as Joseph has a wife who gives birth, that's all you needed. And you don't need a sign. You just the only sign you needed is the only proof you needed is the father was of the lineage of David. And by giving a lineage like this, as long as Joseph is the actual father of Jesus, there's no problem. It's adding the virgin birth that destroys the only sign. That it was a very easy sign to prove. Not even a sign, but it's like it has to be of the Davidic lineage. That's all. So this complicated things and destroyed the proof. This is sabotage. And by the way, that's where I always think Tobias Singer sometimes is trying to tell us something. I think he sometimes thinks there could be some truth down deep. I'm going to just tell him what's the truth. Somebody sabotaged you. Taking out Jesus as being born by Joseph, that was a beautiful sabotage. He doesn't care because he doesn't care about Jesus, ultimately. But the bottom line is this is sabotage. And if it said Jesus's father was also Mary's father, Jesus's grandfather is also Mary's father, and now we're dealing with incest. It's sick, and it's a sick joke. And my theory is to be clear again, Marcion designed had one of his members is Theodotion, a very famous translator from Hebrew to Greek of the quote Old Testament, the Law and the Prophets. He's famous. His work is in the Hexapla of Origen next to Symmachus. There's Symmachus, Theodotion, and a couple of other translations. And this is to show people the various options you have in the way things were translated. And so Theodotion, is famous. He could have done this. He's a Marcionite. He lives in the same city with Marcion. He grew up in Sinope, which is where Marcion grew up and lived. And so there is every reason to believe they went over to Caesarea, one or the both of them, and made a copy of the Hebrew Matthew and then translated it, and then with the objective of eventually translating it into Greek to bomb Christianity and show us a different lineage than was actually in the original Matthew, and then added all kinds of corrupt ideas, and we end up with what we see today. And so all I'm going to say is, if it did say, if the early Greek translation said that Joseph was the father of Mary, that would be just one more piece of sabotage. Now, we have to know that the Hebrew Matthew was many, many times incorporating the Greek or Latin changes that were happening over time. So this Shem Tob, even though it's in Hebrew lettering, does not mean it was the original Hebrew Matthew. Okay, so that's another mistake people mean. Oh, the minute you see it in Hebrew lettering, it must have been the original. No, it's literally taking Latin things that are solely existing in Latin Vulgate and translating them into Hebrew. So it's a ongoing process. The Shem Tob, even you got to read Howard's preface and commentary on what he's translating, not translating, but actually, yes, he's translating into English. He explains all this. So it's not a mystery. In fact, he says, in essence, this is the Latin Vulgate, but with some gems and gold, where there was no need to change what was originally there. And that's where you're getting a focus on something that's much older than the Latin Vulgate, which goes all the way back to 400. So imagine what's older than 400 AD, something gold. but it's not everything. So the Latin Vulgate choked out the original text because the scholars in these debates with the Christian scholars in the 1300s, 1200s, they are forced to defend Judaism in a battle of wits, but they're not allowed to commit any heresy. They're not allowed to deny the Trinity. They're not allowed to deny the virgin birth. So they're actually in a little box, and they got to walk a very tight line. But they are mandated, or it's, excuse me, by the rules of the game, they have to know what's in the Latin Vulgate, but they don't read Latin generally, so they have somebody translates it into Hebrew, and that's Hebrew text is now inside this Hebrew Shem Tob. You see, so that's how the Latin Vulgate gets in, even into the Shem Tob, because they have to know what the Latin text means, so they can debate. And so they may have to learn how to speak enough of this is in Spain and in France. So they're going to have to learn. They usually are going to be able to speak the native tongue of Spanish, or they can speak the native tongue of France. But they're not going to be scholars in Latin. So the Latin Vulgate's not going to help them. They need somebody who knows Latin, who can translate it from Latin into the Hebrew. And so that's the process of the Shem Tob. And so we have to know what created this, and therefore we cannot imagine that that people thought these things are anything but just errant mistakes. Somebody was making this effort of translating over, and inadvertently changed the word for husband into father, and that's what explains it. Otherwise, it's incongruous, and it leads on its face, unless you make suppositions about an imaginary other Joseph. She marries a separate Joseph from here, you end up in incest ultimately. You either have incest on one side, or you have a matrilineal line, which is invalid anyway, so you don't get anywhere. So either way you go, it's horrific. One is horrifically to think of the incestual possibility. The other is you have a matrilineal line, which is ineffective and does not count under Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. Okay, I hope that helps clarify why we cannot accept the Shem Tob proof, even in the 13th century, or even if it were back if Mr. Rood was ever even correct, ultimately, that it was in the 3rd and 4th century, which turns out he's admitted that's not true. It's just simply in no universe will this kind of evidence help us. So, and the fact that it's in the 13th century and in these contesting debates just makes it even more clear that this is unreliable evidence. We could never convince people who are not already Christians of these solutions, and that's ultimately what we must do. We must find the evidence that we can prove people who are not Christians yet that their faith can be based on reasonable things. And when you're asking people who already believe, will you believe things that are unreasonable? Christians will want to believe anything. We have to be able to prove to people who are not Christians that this virgin birth is not a barrier, that it didn't, that we had this itself, and that's my position, was itself a corruption. And the proof of the corruption is actually what we're seeing. The names of the generations, just to go back to one thing that Mr. Rood admitted that you can't take back now, Mr. Rood, is if Jesus, in this scenario, if Mary, let's look here, if Joseph was the husband of Mary and Mary has a child, that comes out to 13 generations, not 14. So let me go back and show you that. So now you would so imagine you get rid of the 13th generation there for Mary. How many? And so you no longer have 14 there, right? So what do you have? You go here. So this is how I had it originally. 12 is Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was Jesus. You only have 13. So what do you end up having? You end up having, excuse me, a problem, because this doesn't work anymore, does it? From the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. No, false. You only have 13. So that's my proof, just one more proof that there is a corruption in this text. Matthew knows how to count. Okay, Matthew did not write these words. Somebody came in to sabotage Christianity, make it impossible for Jesus to be Messiah. The Marcionites did not believe this or not. They were They used the name of Jesus. They believed, quote, in Jesus, but they did not believe it was Messiah for whatever crazy reasons. But they believed he was God from birth. So the virgin birth fit into their universe of ideas because they believe Jesus, the way they depict it is Jesus was God from birth, that he just really existed. He just came up, started walking around just like in Mark, just talking and had no they basically made it sound like it was a God that who just came down, descended from heaven. Maybe that's the way I should put it. That's what you would assume reading the Gospel of Mark, almost like in the book of Mark. Jesus just walks on the stage and you don't know where he came from. That's how the Marcionites did it. But he also was God from eternity when he was here. So this virgin birth perfectly fits in with their attitudes and will be exactly how they would sabotage as us, and then add the word Jaconia into the lineage of Matthew, which was never there initially, and then make up all this stuff, and with the money bags of Marcion, spend the money to make enough copies of this wrong text that it would take over and be like wildfire, because people would just fall for it. It's just so lovable, a little baby who's really God, and in a manger, and that's exactly how pagans viewed their gods. They had gods that were born as children in human form, and so it's not unique. So now it fit a pagan way of viewing God, that God could actually be a child, like God would even do that. I mean, it sounds great, he's God showing his human or humble self, but you know what? That's really us pushing what we want to. We want to bring God down to our level rather than us. He wants to bring us up to his level, and we're trying to bring him down to our level. I think there's a lot of a little wish fulfillment in pagan thinking. That's a pagan idea, to make God into a little baby. All right. Anyway, God bless you. I hope this helps everybody to get clarity that this Shem Tob variance that Nehemiah Gordon found should be left in the dustbin of history. We need to move on to something that can really work. I've tried to provide that. The proof from the Syriac Sinaiticus, found by Miss Lewis, Agnes Lewis, is the correct starting point, where the manuscript actually does say unequivocally Joseph begat Jesus in the line. And then we have plenty of proof from the New Testament. Paul says Jesus is of the seed of David. We have Justin Martyr in 2 places just reading out Joseph begat Jesus, and so on and so forth. So we've got plenty of evidence to prove logically to a person who isn't already a Christian, not already committed, that you can trust our texts. We are able to fix them, even though it's 2 millennia later. We finally found the original manuscripts that prove that it was fraudulently corrupted later. And there's a lot more proof than just those texts. I'm just giving you some highlights. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.